A lot of people romanticize isolation. You see it all over social media, people romanticizing the idea of dropping everything, abandoning the city, and living in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. They think isolation brings peace. They think silence brings clarity. But true silence doesn't exist in the wild. When you take away the noise of cars, sirens, and human voices, you don't get silence. You just start hearing the things that the city noise was drowning out. My name is David. In the summer of 2021, I was 22, broke, and desperately needing a reset. I had just dropped out of my third semester of college, and my life felt like it was spiraling. So, when I saw a listing on a government forestry website for a seasonal fire lookout in the deep Pacific Northwest, I applied immediately. The pay was decent, but more importantly, it offered 3 months of absolute solitude. No roommates, no cell service, just me, a radio, and millions of acres of pine trees. I was assigned to Blackwood Ridge, specifically Tower 4. To give you an idea of how remote this place was, I had to drive 3 hours out of Seattle, take a dirt logging road for another 50 miles until my car literally couldn't go any further, and then hike 8 miles up a steep, winding mountain trail carrying a 70-pound pack of supplies. When I finally broke through the tree line, I saw it. Tower 4. It was an old structure, built sometime in the late 1960s. It was a 40-foot tall, wooden skeleton supporting a 14 by 14-foot glass cabin at the very top. It looked fragile, like a stiff wind could blow it right over the edge of the mountain. My supervisor, a gruff guy named Miller, had hiked up with me to show me the ropes. "All right, kid," Miller said, out of breath as we climbed the wooden stairs to the catwalk circling the cabin. "It's pretty simple. You wake up at sunrise, you check the horizon for smoke. If you see smoke, you use the Osborne fire finder in the center of the room to get the coordinates, and you radio it into base. You do a weather report at 8 a.m. and 8 o'clock p.m. Outside of that, read a book. Don't go crazy." He handed me a heavy ring of brass keys. He started walking back down the stairs, but paused on the third step, looking back up at me. The jovial, exhausting tone in his voice had vanished, replaced by something flat and serious. "One more thing, David. The wildlife out here. It gets curious. Bears, cougars. But it's not the animals you need to worry about. Once the sun goes down, you lock the trapdoor at the top of the stairs. You draw the blinds on all 4 sides. And no matter what you hear down on the ground, you do not go down those stairs until sunrise." "Understood." I chuckled, thinking he was hazing the new guy. "Sure, Miller. Lock the door." "Got it." He didn't laugh. He just stared at me for a few seconds, nodded slowly, and began the long hike down. For the first 2 weeks, it was paradise. The view was breathtaking. A sea of dark green evergreens rolling over mountains as far as the eye could see. I spent my days reading, sketching, and scanning the horizon. The routine was incredibly grounding. Every morning at 8 a.m., I'd key the heavy, black two-way radio on the desk. "Base, this is Tower 4. Weather report." "Go ahead, Tower 4." Miller's voice would crackle back. "Temp is 62 degrees. Wind is blowing northwest at 5 knots. Visibility is 100%. No smoke." "Copy that, Tower 4. Have a good day." It was perfect. Until day 17. It started with a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped unexpectedly in the late afternoon, and a thick, unnatural fog began to roll into the valleys below, turning the tops of the trees into islands in a sea of gray milk. At 8 p.m., I went to the radio to do my evening check-in. I pressed the transmission button. "Base, this is Tower 4. Evening weather report." There was no immediate answer, just static. This wasn't entirely unusual. Storms or atmospheric changes could occasionally mess with the signal. I waited 30 seconds and tried again. "Base, this is Tower 4. Do you copy?" The static broke, but it wasn't Miller's voice that came back. It was a voice heavily distorted by interference, sounding almost hollow, like it was being spoken through a long metal pipe. "Base, this is Tower 4. Evening weather report." I frowned. It was a loop of my own transmission, bouncing back to me. A weird radio echo. I pressed the button again. "Base, I think we have an echo on the frequency. Do you read me?" The radio hissed, and then the hollow, metallic voice spoke again. But this time, it wasn't a recording of what I had just said. "Temp is 62 degrees. Wind is blowing northwest at 5 knots. A cold chill washed over my arms. That was my exact report from that morning. But the cadence was wrong. The pauses between the words were too long, unnatural, as if someone, or something, was piecing together recordings of my voice to form sentences, like a terrifying audio ransom note. "Who is this?" I demanded, my thumb pressing hard onto the mic button. "Miller, is this a joke?" The radio went dead silent. The static completely cut out, leaving a heavy, dead air that felt oppressive. Then, a click, and the voice whispered, using my exact vocal tone, but stripped of all emotion. "Do not go down those stairs." I ripped my hand away from the radio, as if it had burned me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at the black box, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. I tried to rationalize it. Some prankster with a ham radio down in the valley. A weird atmospheric bounce recording my voice and sending it back. I forced myself to believe the logical explanation. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into absolute blackness, I remembered Miller's rule. I quickly pulled the heavy canvas blinds down over the 360-degree windows. I went to the trapdoor in the floor, the only way in or out of the cabin, and slid the heavy iron deadbolt into place. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my sleeping bag with a heavy maglite flashlight, jumping at every creak of the wooden stilts swaying in the wind. The next morning, the sun broke through, and everything felt less terrifying. I told myself I had let the isolation get to my head. At 8 a.m., I called base. "Base, this is Tower 4. "Morning, Tower 4. "Go ahead," Miller replied, sounding perfectly normal. I asked him if anyone else used this frequency, or if there were any ham radio operators nearby. He sounded confused and said no. It was a closed, encrypted government channel. Nobody could broadcast on it without their exact equipment. I didn't tell him about the voice. I didn't want to sound crazy and lose the job. Days 18 through 22 were quiet. Too quiet. The birds had stopped singing near my tower. The deer I usually saw grazing in the clearing below had vanished. It was as if a perimeter of dead silence had been drawn around my sector of the forest. On day 23, I was looking through my high-powered binoculars, scanning a distant ridge about 3 miles away. I was sweeping across the treeline when I saw something that made my breath hitch in my throat. Standing at the very edge of a rocky outcropping, perfectly framed against the sky, was a figure. It was too far away to see details, but the proportions were wrong. It looked vaguely human, but it was incredibly tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and its limbs hung down past its knees. It was wearing something bright yellow. I adjusted the focus on the binoculars. My blood turned to ice water. It was wearing a yellow windbreaker, the exact same bright yellow vintage North Face windbreaker I had hanging on the hook by my door. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't hiking. It was just standing there, facing exactly in the direction of my tower. I watched it for an hour. It never shifted its weight. It never turned its head. It stood with the rigid stillness of a statue. When I looked away to grab my water bottle and looked back, it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a weirdly shaped dead tree. Paranoia was a well-documented side effect of cabin fever. I tried to shake it off, but an intense feeling of being watched settled over me. It felt like an itch at the back of my skull that I couldn't scratch. That night, the radio came to life again. It was 2 a.m. I was dead asleep when the harsh burst of static startled me awake. The cabin was pitch black, save for the small green LED light on the radio console. "David," it was my voice, but it sounded wet, gargled, like I was speaking with a mouth full of thick mud. "David, open the door." I froze in my cot. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. "It's cold outside." "David." The voice was coming from the radio. But as I lay there, trembling in the dark, I heard a sound that made my soul try to leave my body. Creak. It was the sound of weight being put on the lowest wooden step of the tower stairs, 40 feet below me. Creak. The second step. Whatever it was incredibly heavy. The wooden structure of the tower groaned under the pressure. Creak, creak, creak. It was climbing. Slowly, methodically. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't climb stairs like that. It sounded bipedal, but the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. I silently rolled out of my cot and crawled across the floor on my hands and knees toward the trapdoor. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the floorboards. Creak. It was halfway up. The radio hissed again. I am coming up, David. My own voice mocked me from the speaker above my head. I grabbed the heavy metal fire extinguisher from the wall bracket. My hands slick with cold sweat. I knelt by the trapdoor, the deadbolt securely fastened, praying to whatever God was listening that the wood would hold. Creak. The catwalk. It was right outside the glass. I stopped breathing. The only sound in the world was the violent thumping of my own heart. I stared at the bottom of the canvas blinds that covered the floor-to-ceiling windows. There was a gap, about an inch of space between the bottom of the blind and the floor. I watched as 2 feet stepped into the moonlight, filtering through that gap. They were bare, pale, and massive, but they weren't feet. The toes were elongated, practically fingers, ending in thick, hardened nails. And they were covered in dirt and dried blood. The entity slowly walked the perimeter of the catwalk. It was dragging something against the glass. A long, sharp fingernail. Screech. It circled the entire cabin. It was testing the perimeter, looking for a way in. Then, it stopped directly over the trapdoor. I was looking straight up at the wooden hatch. The wood suddenly buckled inward as something impossibly heavy stepped right onto it from above. A hand, or what passed for one, slid under the slight gap of the trapdoor. Long, spindly, pale fingers with too many joints groped blindly in the dark, scraping against the iron deadbolt. Open it, my voice whispered, not from the radio this time, but from right on the other side of the wood, less than 2 feet from my face. I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall of the cabin, clutching the fire extinguisher to my chest like a child holding a teddy bear. It stayed there for hours, occasionally scratching at the deadbolt, occasionally whispering my name in my own voice. It wasn't until the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the edges of the blinds that I heard it slowly walk back down the stairs and disappear into the forest. When the sun was fully up, I practically tore the radio mic off its cord. Base, this is Tower 4. Emergency. Get me out of here. Tower 4, this is Miller. What's the emergency? Is there a fire? No, there's someone out here. Something tried to get into the tower last night. I need a medevac or a ranger up here right now. There was a long pause. When Miller spoke again, his voice was tight. David, calm down. Look out your window. Look at the catwalk. I hesitated. I kept the fire extinguisher raised as I slowly pulled back the corner of one of the blinds. The catwalk was empty, but carved deep into the wooden railing. Right outside the window were dozens of tallies, scratch marks, like a prisoner counting days. There's nothing here, Miller, but it was here. I swear to God. David, Miller sighed heavily. Pack your gear. Start hiking down immediately. I'm meeting you at the logging road. Why didn't you warn me? I screamed into the mic. You knew something was out here. Just hike down, kid. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. I didn't pack anything except my keys and my wallet. I unbolted the trapdoor, practically threw it open, and sprinted down those 40 feet of stairs so fast I almost broke my neck. I ran the 8 miles down the mountain trail in record time. I didn't stop to drink water. I didn't stop to breathe. Every time I heard a twig snap in the woods, I expected to see that yellow windbreaker and those impossibly long limbs stepping out of the pines. When I finally reached the dirt road, Miller was waiting in his truck, engine running. He threw the passenger door open, and I dove in. He slammed on the gas before I even closed the door. We drove in silence for 20 minutes before I finally caught my breath enough to speak. What was it, Miller? What the hell is up there? Miller kept his eyes fixed firmly on the dirt road ahead. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. We call them mimics, he said quietly. Nobody knows what they are. Wendigos, skinwalkers, mountain spirits. Whatever name you want to give them. They live deep in the old growth. They don't have their own voice, their own identity. So they steal ours. They watch the lookouts. They listen to the radio broadcasts. They learn how to be us. I stared at him, horrified. Why do you keep sending people up there if you know they're there? Miller finally looked at me, and the expression on his face will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a look of profound, crushing guilt, because as long as they are fixated on the person in the tower, they don't come down into the valley towns looking for material. I quit the forestry service that day. I moved back to the East Coast, to a dense city where there are sirens, traffic, and millions of people. I haven't been in a forest since. But sometimes, late at night, when my apartment is perfectly quiet, my cell phone will ring. The caller ID will say unknown. I don't answer it anymore. Because the last time I did, I didn't hear a telemarketer or a wrong number. I just heard a wet, gargled voice, using my exact pitch, my exact tone, whispering through the speaker. David, I am still coming down the stairs.